Frankie's illness eventually forced his retirement, but Carson gave him one last emotional farewell on stage, presenting him with the retired lens from his custom camera as a trophy. Years later, his daughter found the ultimate proof of Johnny's secret generosity, a simple 3-word instruction, "Protect the family," scrawled on an unused cue card. Frankie Russo, known only as Fingers to the rest of the crew, was one of those unseen architects of fame, the quiet, meticulous craftsman whose work formed the visual foundation of late-night television. For 20 years, Frankie had been anchored behind camera 2, positioned perfectly to capture the most intimate close-ups of every superstar who ever sat next to the iconic ferns. He was, in essence, the most dependable man in Studio One, a bedrock of the show who hadn't missed a single day of taping since Gerald Ford was in the White House. He was the anchor, the quiet sentinel, the one person Johnny Carson always knew he could rely on to frame that perfect, knowing smile, or catch the subtle flicker of surprise when a joke landed just right. Frankie and Johnny had an unspoken language, a deep, professional bond forged in the intense, high-stakes heat of live television. While the audience saw the jovial banter with Ed McMahon, Carson saw the slight, professional tilt of Frankie's camera head, the almost imperceptible nod that communicated, "I'm ready for your close-up, boss." This silent communication was the lifeblood of The Tonight Show's flawless presentation. The host and the cameraman were perfectly synchronized, 2 parts of a single, brilliant machine. That night, a typical Tuesday in the fall of 1987, was supposed to be routine. The monologue was flying high, the audience was roaring with laughter, and Johnny was in his element. That cool, unflappable master of ceremonies who seemed immune to any kind of real-world trouble or vulnerability. But Carson, the master observer, the keenest eye in the business, possessed an antenna finely tuned to the minutiae of his stage, and he noticed a silence that was louder than any laugh. The perfect, effortless rhythm had encountered a subtle, invisible snag. During a commercial break, when Ed McMahon was getting his makeup touched up and Doc Severance's band was tuning their instruments for the next celebrity segment, Johnny walked off stage. He didn't retreat toward his luxurious dressing room. Instead, he walked deliberately toward the camera bays, an area of the studio usually invisible to the star. He stopped at camera 2, nodding to Frankie, who was diligently checking his light levels with focused intensity. "Hey, Fingers," Johnny said, casual as ever, using the affectionate nickname that was a badge of honor among the inner circle of the crew. "Great show tonight. That transition to the first guest was smooth." Frankie just nodded, but his response was wrong. He gripped the heavy camera handles a little too tightly, his knuckles white against the black metal housing of the equipment. And when he turned his head slightly to acknowledge and answer the host, it wasn't the slow, steady, controlled turn of a professional veteran. There was a barely noticeable flicker, a rapid, involuntary pulse in his neck and chin, like a tiny engine misfiring deep inside his nervous system. "Thanks, Mr. Carson," Frankie mumbled, keeping his eyes glued to the viewfinder, desperate to mask the physical betrayal that was taking place within his body. "Just doing my job." Johnny lingered for a second longer, watching Frankie meticulously wipe a speck of imaginary dust off the lens, an unnecessary, frantic action that betrayed his intense anxiety. The cameraman's hand, the legendary hand that could glide that massive camera smoothly across the studio floor, was not entirely steady. It was a tremor so subtle that anyone less attuned to the studio's subtle rhythms, would have dismissed it as simple fatigue. But to Johnny, who had watched that hand for 2 decades, it was a profound, discordant note in the flawless symphony of the show. Johnny knew the financial terror that stalked the lives of men like Frankie, the vital crew members who had no multi-million-dollar contracts, no guaranteed safety net. They were the men who lived paycheck to paycheck, whose greatest fear wasn't a bad rating, but a sudden, catastrophic health crisis that would erase decades of financial planning. And whatever Johnny saw in the depths of Frankie's eyes, a depth that seemed suddenly haunted by an invisible threat, it confirmed his suspicion. This wasn't just a tough day, this was the look of a man carrying a secret burden that could shatter his life and his family's future. Carson returned to his desk for the next segment, but his focus was broken. The effortless banter felt strained. He kept glancing at the glowing red light on camera 2, watching the way Frankie's head seemed to be resisting his own will. The invisible man of The Tonight Show, the quiet master behind the lens, was cracking. And only the man under the spotlight, the master observer, seemed to notice the silent signs of a life coming apart behind the lens. Something was deeply, tragically wrong with the silent man who was the very backbone of the operation. Tomorrow night, that tremor will not just risk blurring the shot, it will publicly challenge the one thing Johnny Carson demands: professional perfection. The tremor that began as a whisper quickly became a shout on the main monitor, visible to millions. It was a fundamental technical mistake for The Tonight Show, revealing the medical crisis Frankie Russo had desperately hidden. The segment began with Johnny interviewing a movie star, demanding a crucial close-up. As Frankie zoomed, the image suddenly jumped, a sickening, jarring hiccup. In the control booth, director Dick swore, wrenching the feed away, but the unforgivable error had aired. Dick ripped off his headset, looking at executive producer Fred de Cordova in terror. "What was that? We can't have this." Fred nodded grimly. It was Frankie. Something's going on. They knew the merciless rule. A cameraman who couldn't hold a smooth shot couldn't keep his job. Dick pressed his mic. "Fred, if that happens one more time, I'm thinking of a discreet termination before the week is out." Fred confirmed the network's lack of tolerance for imperfection. On the floor, the crew was frozen, staring in shock at Frankie, who was slumped over his camera, his pride publicly exposed. His grip had lost him. Johnny, maintaining the illusion of normalcy, waited until the commercial break. He walked deliberately past camera 2 and leaned in to speak only to Frankie. He didn't mention the mistake. Instead, he spoke a subtle signal of support. "Hey, Fingers, remember that time we had the chimp on? You didn't even flinch. That's why you're the best, pal." It was Johnny telling him, "I see the man, not just the mistake," but the damage was done. Frankie's fear was palpable. Without the show's robust insurance, his family faced crushing financial hardship. Later, Johnny watched the slow-motion replay. When Ed McMahon sauntered in, oblivious, Johnny muttered, "It's Frankie. He's always there. Like the ferns. You don't notice them until they're gone." Johnny knew Dick and Fred were already planning the inevitable talk. The quiet severance would end a 20-year career. The resignation papers were moving through the system, a cold, clinical conclusion. But Johnny Carson decided, with deep conviction, that he would protect the man. The cold, official paper was waiting for Johnny on his massive wooden desk, the definitive, bureaucratic conclusion to Frankie Russo's 20-year run. The document was stark and emotionless, a termination notice carefully disguised as a voluntary medical leave. But the truth of the heartbreak it contained was written in tiny, trembling print. Fred de Cordova, the executive producer, had slid the folder onto the desk just moments before the next taping began, his face drawn with the unpleasantness of the task. "He signed it, Johnny, said he didn't want the embarrassment, doesn't want to be that guy." Fred didn't need to elaborate. That guy was the one who slows everyone down, the one whose weakness compromises the show's required perfection. The network had accepted the resignation, allowing Frankie to leave with a sliver of false dignity, but crucially cutting off his access to the critical long-term health benefits he and his family desperately needed for his escalating condition. Johnny sat down, his hands that had held hundreds of cue cards and countless celebrity secrets, slowly opening the file. The reason for leaving, typed neatly under personal medical condition, was followed by a single terrifying phrase scribbled in Frankie's familiar, loopy handwriting: early onset Parkinson's disease. It wasn't just a clinical diagnosis, it was a metaphorical wrecking ball aimed directly at Frankie's quiet, responsible life. Frankie's world was entirely defined by the relentless, steady turning of the camera wheels and the stability of his paycheck. He wasn't a celebrity, he was a working man, a dedicated father who had been meticulously building a small future for his daughter, Lisa. Lisa was everything to Frankie, a brilliant student enrolled in a demanding university program 300 miles away. She was pursuing a degree in architectural design, a massive dream paid for exclusively by every close-up, every perfectly framed shot of Johnny. Frankie's insurance through the show was the fragile backbone of that dream, covering not just his routine health care, but the astronomical cost of her tuition. Without the job, the insurance vanished immediately. Lisa would have to come home, her educational future derailed by a single, catastrophic, neurological malfunction. Frankie's secret illness had been his most guarded possession. He had hidden the involuntary movements from his daughter for months, practicing his complex camera movements long after the crew left the studio, trying desperately to force his body to obey his will. He would spend hours in his empty living room, holding a broomstick like a heavy camera head, attempting to execute the seamless zoom. His muscles would spasm, his breath would seize, but he kept trying, fueled only by the terrifying, cold knowledge that his hands were all that stood between his daughter and a lifetime of crippling debt. He knew the shame of the tremor, the crushing fear of disappointing his child, had driven him to make the agonizing decision. Quit quickly, quietly, and completely, before the network could officially fire him and strip him of even nominal dignity. He thought he was sparing his pride, but he was actually cutting off his only lifeline to long-term health and financial stability. Johnny stared at the words, early onset Parkinson's disease. It was a cruel, poetic irony. The man whose entire existence depended on stillness, on the steadiness of his gaze and his hands, was being slowly, cruelly betrayed by his own nervous system. The progressive disease was stealing his profession, his security, and soon, his daughter's entire future. Johnny pushed the papers away violently. He wouldn't sign them. The legendary Carson cool, the practiced indifference he used as a professional shield against the pressures of fame, dissolved instantly into a deep, frustrated, paternal compassion. He knew the network hierarchy would be furious at the interference, but seeing Frankie's name next to that catastrophic diagnosis, realizing the years of dedicated, unseen work, made the decision simple and immediate. He would not allow 20 years of loyalty to be extinguished by a bureaucratic paper shuffle. He picked up the phone, not to call Fred de Cordova, his executive producer, but to call a private number he had never used for a crew member before. He decided that if the official channel had chosen the cold path of severance, he would take the unofficial channel, the personal, human one. He would approach the invisible man not as the king of late night, but as a man owing a profound professional debt. The debt of 2 decades of perfect close-ups. Carson had a debt to pay, and the next day he wasn't going to call the producer or the director. He was going straight to the source of the heartbreak. Carson didn't call the studio. He called the home he knew Frankie Russo was about to lose to medical bills and tuition. It was a private number, one he'd usually used only to thank A-list celebrities, not to investigate the intimate heartbreak of a cameraman. But the moment the phone was answered, the king of late night found himself speaking to the one person Frankie Russo never wanted him to know about. Hello? The voice was young, educated, and tired, the sound of profound stress. It was Lisa, Frankie's daughter, who was home for a short, agonizing break between classes, already packing up her few belongings for what she thought would be a temporary but necessary move back home. Hello, is Frankie there? Johnny asked, using his quiet, off-camera voice, stripped of his public charm. He gave only his last name. This is Mr. Carson. Lisa, busy folding laundry, didn't immediately connect the famous name to the star. She just heard a polite stranger. He's resting, sir. He's not feeling well. Can I take a message? I just needed to talk to him about the show, Johnny pressed gently. He realized this young woman, whose entire future was riding entirely on his next move, was completely unaware of the depth of the disaster unfolding. He decided to play the scene differently. He didn't want to break the terrible news. He wanted to understand the absolute depth of the trouble he was facing. He steered the conversation carefully, asking about her studies and her passion for architecture. Lisa's reserve broke quickly. She was a scholar, a woman of big dreams, but her voice was tight with stress and resignation. I love it, Mr. Carson, but I'm not going back next semester. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute, marking the end of a long-held dream. Oh? Why not, if you don't mind me asking? Johnny asked, masking his rising concern with practiced ease. A small, choked sound came across the line. The tuition, sir, it's too much. And my dad, he's leaving the Tonight Show. He hasn't told anyone, but he gave notice. He told me he was moving to a different schedule, but I know he's going to lose the health insurance, and with his condition, we can't afford both the payments and the specialists. It wasn't just the job, it was the entire foundation of their lives and her future. Johnny heard the raw, desperate exhaustion in her voice, the audible sound of a dream being quietly packed away into a cardboard box. He realized Frankie wasn't just sacrificing his career, he was sacrificing his daughter's future to keep his secret safe and his pride intact. Suddenly, a loud, angry whisper erupted in the background, a sound of fury and acute shame. "Who is that? Give me the phone." Frankie, who had been listening in agonizing silence from the next room, snatched the receiver. His breathing was ragged, laced with shame and raw fury at the intrusion. "Mr. Carson, I told you, I'm taking leave. It's handled. This has nothing to do with you or the show." His voice was laced with fury and agonizing humiliation that his personal struggle had been exposed. "I made my choice. You have absolutely no right to interfere with my family's private struggle. You stay out of this, Mr. Carson, you hear me?" "Frankie, I have your paperwork right here," Johnny said, dropping the casual act for immediate confrontation. "The paperwork says you have a problem that requires specialized care, and I know that specialized care is cripplingly expensive. And I know your daughter is giving up her education because she thinks she's being noble." Frankie's voice cracked in defeat. "Don't you dare, Mr. Carson. Don't you dare talk about my family. I made my choice. I'll figure it out." "No," Johnny said, the voice of the king firming up with unassailable authority. "You made your choice. You didn't make my choice. For 20 years, you gave me the perfect shot. You made me look like a genius. I owe you. And I'm not talking about money, Frankie. I'm talking about dignity." The line went silent, Frankie having no counter. Johnny knew he had him. Frankie was a man whose pride was his armor, and Carson had just found the key to penetrate it, the protection of his daughter. The problem wasn't just a tremor anymore, it was a devastating debt that only the man who commanded the spotlight could quietly settle without breaking the man who served him. Johnny made a demand, not a request, a private meeting immediately. The stakes were no longer about a camera position. They were about securing a young woman's future and saving an honorable man from drowning in silent shame. If you believe loyalty is more important than ratings, hit that subscribe button and follow the rest of this story to see the radical steps Johnny takes to protect his friend's dignity. The private summit was held not in a sterile conference room with lawyers, but in Johnny Carson's inner sanctum, his spacious, wood-paneled office behind the set, a room so exclusive even most producers only saw the doorway. Frankie Russo walked in, not as the dependable cameraman, but as a condemned man stripped of his professional identity, ready to accept his fate. Carson sat at his massive wooden desk, a man stripped of his public, easy smile, wearing the serious, private expression few ever witnessed. "Close the door, Frankie," Johnny said, his voice low and devoid of levity. "Take a seat." Frankie remained standing, clutching his worn hat, assuming the worst, a quiet firing and a token severance package. "Mr. Carson, with all respect, there's no need for this meeting. I signed the papers. I know I messed up the close-up. I can't hold the shot anymore. I need to go." "I haven't signed the papers," Johnny stated simply, holding up the untouched envelope like an exhibit in court. "And you're not quitting. You're not walking out the door." Frankie was stunned into silence. "But the tremor, sir, it's only going to get worse. I can't jeopardize the show." Johnny leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, fixing Frankie with that piercing, intelligent stare that had held millions captive for decades. "You're not jeopardizing anything. You're giving me an opportunity. For 20 years, you've been the eye of the storm. I owe you better than this." He cut straight to the heart of the matter. "I know about your daughter, Lisa. I know she's talented, and I know she's trying to drop out of university because she thinks she has to protect your pride and handle your medical expenses. That stops today. That ends now." Frankie's face flushed scarlet. "You had no right to call my home, Mr. Carson. No right to involve my family in this." "I have every right," Johnny countered, his voice rising slightly in uncharacteristic intensity. "I have the right to protect the man who protected me every night for 2 decades, the man whose illness is threatening to undo a lifetime of honest work and devotion." Then came the pledge, the promise that only the king of late night could deliver and guarantee. "You will remain the cameraman for camera 2. Your insurance remains intact. Your daughter will finish her architecture degree paid for. And here's how we're going to handle your problem physically." Johnny pulled out a blueprint, not for a comedy sketch, but for a piece of advanced custom engineering. The paper detailed a highly specialized rig designed not just for basic stability, but for complete concealment of operator movement. I'm having a new camera system built, not from the network, which would take years, but from a private robotics company in Palo Alto. It's a gyroscope-stabilized rig designed specifically to negate involuntary movements. It will be the most advanced piece of equipment in the entire studio, and it will be assigned permanently to camera 2. It's expensive, Frankie, wildly expensive, worth more than any celebrity endorsement contract I've ever signed. But every close-up you gave me was priceless. Frankie, completely overwhelmed, finally sank into the chair, tears silently streaming down his face, the emotion too much to bear. Mr. Carson, I don't know what to say. I can't accept charity. It's not charity, Johnny stated, his voice softening into the familiar, intimate tone of a friend speaking frankly. It's a debt being settled. You taught me that the best work is often done by the people who never seek applause. Now let me teach you that loyalty isn't just a word you say, it's a debt you pay. The handshake they shared was the final contract, sealing an arrangement that had just secured the future of an entire family. This hidden promise was about to cause an absolute sensation when the crew saw the physical evidence of Carson's extraordinary generosity and power. The next Monday night, taping felt profoundly different. The air in Studio One was thick with unspoken questions and simmering speculation. Frankie Russo was back at camera 2, quiet, focused, but a massive, shrouded machine stood where his old camera used to be. Everyone knew Frankie had signed the termination papers, yet here he was. The purchase order hadn't gone through the network budget. The funds had simply materialized, attached to a nondescript shell corporation based out of Omaha, Nebraska, and signed off with an untouchable authority. Minutes before the show went live, Johnny Carson, looking more serious and purposeful than usual, walked directly onto the studio floor. He didn't look at the audience. He walked right past the familiar desks and the iconic ferns, stopping centrally at Frankie's workstation. Johnny placed a single hand on the velvet cloth covering the machine. "Folks, we have a new piece of equipment tonight," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent studio floor, addressing the crew first. "This camera, which we will call Camera 2 Prime, is the first of its kind in television. It uses advanced stabilization technology designed to capture shots with zero tolerance for error." Then came the flourish that shocked everyone. Johnny grasped the edge of the cloth and with a powerful, dramatic sweep, yanked it away. Revealed beneath was the futuristic, matte black camera rig, a device that looked like it belonged on a space mission. The crew gasped audibly. It was custom, revolutionary, and looked like it cost more than the rest of the studio equipment combined. Johnny turned and looked directly at Frankie, pointedly ignoring the cameras pointed at him from other angles. "This isn't just a technological upgrade," he stated, his eyes boring into Frankie's with profound meaning. "This is an investment in the finest eye in this business." He then addressed the entire crew, his words ringing with profound finality. "This camera, this position, and the technology that runs it are designed for one person and one person only. They are customized for the greatest, most dependable hand in late-night television. They belong to Frankie Russo, and they are not going anywhere." The audience, sensing the monumental importance of the moment, roared into a standing ovation, a true, sustained roar of recognition and respect. Frankie, standing behind the console of his new, majestic machine, simply nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed gratitude. The immense public investment and guarantee restored his confidence completely. The crew was stunned by Carson's gesture. "What's the greatest act of loyalty you've ever witnessed a boss show an employee? Drop a comment below and share the story." The red light on Camera 2 Prime flashed, and the show went live. This was a high-wire act. Frankie's body still moved with the involuntary rhythm of his illness, but his shot, the crucial close-up of Johnny delivering his punchline, was rock steady. The gyroscopes, financed personally by the king of late night, absorbed every tremor, presenting an image of perfect, unwavering focus. On the monitor, Frankie's camera work was flawless, perhaps the best, most steady of his entire 20-year career. Johnny hadn't just saved a job, he had restored a man's pride and protected his livelihood without a single public word of pity. During the next commercial break, Johnny walked over to Camera 2. He pulled out 2 small, unmarked bottles of root beer, Frankie's favorite, a tiny detail only the most observant would remember. "Ed's hitting the bar," Johnny said quietly. "I figure we earned a better toast." Frankie lifted the bottle, but just before the toast, his hand hesitated, a tiny shake of self-doubt. Johnny saw the fleeting insecurity. He gently clinked his bottle against Frankie's. That shot of the actress's face in the second segment? Nobody else could have held that timing. That was the genius of fingers, Frankie. That wasn't the machine. That was you. "To loyalty," Frankie said firmly, clinking his glass against the lens of the camera 2 prime. "Exactly," Johnny confirmed. "We're a team. You're the eye and I'm the face. I need you right where you are." When the show resumed, Frankie delivered the ultimate close-up, a genuine, unrehearsed shot of Johnny laughing so hard at a guest's joke that his eyes crinkled with pure, unscripted joy. The flawless image was proof that Carson's investment had paid off, not just in technical terms, but in the restoration of a man's dignity. Frankie Russo had his job, but the magnificent machine couldn't pay the mounting medical bills or the remaining tuition. The king had one more secret payment to make, one that would arrive anonymously, carefully protecting the cameraman's powerful professional pride. One gray morning, a week after the new camera arrived, an official-looking envelope landed in Frankie's mailbox, postmarked from a nondescript P.O. box. Inside was a crisp, official cashier's check for a staggering $50,000. Next to it was a small, handwritten note, deliberately unsigned. Frankie stared, bewildered. His daughter Lisa was tragically poring over her university withdrawal forms. $50,000 was the exact amount needed to cover her remaining tuition and the initial specialized treatments. Frankie picked up the A note. The handwriting, neat and flowing, was instantly recognizable as that used on the Tonight Show cue cards. The note simply read, "Payment for 2 decades of perfect close-ups. Unpaid debt settled. Do not contact me about this matter. Tell Lisa to choose the tallest building she can imagine. This is strictly transactional." Frankie realized the truth. Carson hadn't given him charity. He had framed the gift as a compensation settlement for a debt. His internal voice screamed at him to tear the check in half, but he looked at Lisa, who was staring at the check with tear-stained but suddenly profound hope. Frankie crumpled the anonymous note into his pocket. "It's a compensation package," Frankie lied smoothly, his voice shaking. "Some kind of bonus the network owed me for the new camera setup." Lisa didn't question it. The money was a miracle. She immediately secured her place for the next semester. Frankie stood by the kitchen window, watching his daughter laugh for the first time in months. He knew he could never thank Carson. The only way to honor this unbelievable gesture was to operate Camera 2 Prime with the unwavering professionalism that had earned him this unspoken, anonymous reward. The king of late night had not only restored a career, but had also quietly saved a family from ruin, demanding nothing in return but continued anonymity. The years moved on, measured in the steady, rhythmic perfection of the shots delivered faithfully from Camera 2 Prime. The machine had hidden Frankie's illness, maintained his dignity, and ensured his daughter Lisa finished university and started her own successful career. 5 years after the camera arrived, the tremor was too pronounced. Frankie Russo sat Johnny down in his private office, accepting defeat with quiet dignity. "I can't cheat physics anymore, Mr. Carson," Frankie said simply. "I'm going home." Johnny didn't argue. He put a hand on Frankie's shoulder. "Frankie, you gave me 5 more years of the best close-ups in the business. 5 years that gave Lisa her degree. That's not defeat, pal. That's a victory." Johnny had one last unscripted moment. As the Tonight Show went live, Johnny walked out holding a small metallic object. "Ladies and gentlemen," Johnny began, his voice serious, "we're going to dispense with the cue cards tonight, because there's a man leaving us and I need to tell you why." He told the story of Frankie Russo, the Invisible Man, focusing entirely on his loyalty and flawless service. He then presented the object, the main lens from Camera 2 Prime, mounted on a stand like a trophy. "This lens, Frankie," Johnny announced, his voice catching slightly with emotion, "captured millions of laughs and countless iconic moments. It's been retired because it only ever worked perfectly for the greatest eye in television. This is yours." The audience roared into a standing ovation. The king of late night had given the Invisible Man one last glorious moment. After Frankie passed peacefully, Lisa found the lens trophy and tucked away in a lockbox, the cashier's check, and the unsigned handwritten note referring to the unpaid debt. She finally understood. Tucked beneath the check, Lisa found one final relic, a single folded cue card from the night of the camera's unveiling. It was an unused line written in Johnny's flowing script and circled in red marker. It simply read, "Protect the family." The simple instruction, kept private until the very end, served as the ultimate payoff. Carson used his fame, his power, and his untouchable status to build a fortress of protection around a loyal member of his crew, ensuring that Frankie Russo finished his time on Earth with every ounce of his pride intact. In a world obsessed with celebrity, Johnny Carson reminded us that real magic often happens off camera, driven by simple human kindness and the unwavering belief that every single person truly matters. If this story of private kindness moved you, give it a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the most powerful people are the ones who protect the unseen.